What if I told you that before I even understood who I was, the government had already decided it for me? Imagine growing up thinking everything about your life was normal, only to discover one day that every official record connected to your name listed you as female. Not one document. Not two. Every single one. At first, I laughed because it sounded impossible. Then I realized it wasn't a joke. It wasn't a simple typo. It was a mistake that followed me from the day I was born, quietly shaping moments I didn't even realize were connected. But here's the part nobody saw coming. The more I tried to fix those records, the more I started questioning something much deeper than paperwork. I began asking myself whether identity is really something written on a piece of paper, or something only you can define. What happened next completely changed the way I looked at my life forever, and by the end of this story, you'll understand why one tiny word printed on an official document had the power to turn my entire world upside down. For as long as I could remember, I never paid attention to the small details on forms. School enrollment papers were handled by my parents. Medical forms were filled out before appointments. Whenever someone asked for identification, I simply handed over whatever document they requested. Life moved forward the way it does for everyone else. Nothing seemed unusual because nobody ever pointed out a problem. If they noticed something strange, they kept it to themselves. Looking back now, I wonder how many people saw the mistake years before I ever did. The discovery happened on one of the most ordinary days imaginable. I was applying for a document that required copies of several government records. I gathered everything together, spread the papers across the table, and started checking that every name, date, and number matched. That's when my eyes stopped on a single line. Under the section labeled sex, it clearly said female. I blinked once, then twice. I assumed I had picked up someone else's document by accident. But the name was mine. The birth date was mine. The identification number belonged to me. Everything matched except that one word. I thought it had to be an isolated mistake, so I checked another document. Female. Then another. Female again. My smile slowly disappeared. My heart started beating faster, because this wasn't one incorrect record. Somehow, every official database seemed to be repeating the exact same information. My first reaction was confusion, followed immediately by laughter. Surely this would be easy to fix. People make mistakes all the time. One phone call, one visit to an office, maybe fill out a correction form, and everything would return to normal. That's what I believed. I had no idea that I was standing at the beginning of a journey that would test my patience, my confidence, and even my understanding of who I was. When I told my family, the room went silent for a moment before everyone started talking at once. Some insisted it had to be a computer error. Others thought maybe the hospital had made a mistake years ago. One relative joked that I had uncovered the world's longest-running typo. We laughed because laughter is often easier than admitting we don't understand something. But underneath those jokes was a growing realization that none of us actually knew how this had happened. The next morning I walked into the government office carrying a folder filled with every document I owned. I expected someone behind the counter to glance at the papers, stamp a correction form, and send me home. Instead, the employee looked at the screen, frowned, and called another employee over. They whispered to each other while occasionally looking in my direction. Then a supervisor appeared. Suddenly, 3 people were staring at the same computer monitor. That's when I realized this wasn't going to be simple. The supervisor politely explained that according to their system, my records had always identified me as female. Since multiple databases shared the same information, changing one record would require verification from several different departments. Birth records, hospital records, civil registration, identification services, and other offices all needed to agree before anything could be corrected. I left that building carrying exactly the same folder I had walked in with, except now it felt 10 times heavier. Over the following weeks, I visited office after office. Every place asked for another document. Every document required another signature. Every signature depended on another office. It felt like being trapped inside a maze where every exit led to another hallway instead of the outside world. Some employees treated me with kindness. They genuinely wanted to help. Others looked at me with confusion, trying to understand how someone standing in front of them could appear one way while official records insisted something else entirely. I could see the questions in their eyes even when they never spoke them aloud. One afternoon, an older clerk quietly said something that stayed with me forever. He looked at the paperwork, looked at me, smiled gently, and said, "Sometimes paper tells a story that reality doesn't." At first, I didn't fully understand what he meant. As the process continued, I found myself thinking more deeply about identity than I ever had before. It's easy to believe we know exactly who we are because we've lived with ourselves every day. But when every official system insists something different, you begin to notice how much power documents actually have. A single word on paper can affect applications, travel, employment, healthcare, banking, and countless moments people never think about until something goes wrong. For the first time in my life, I realized that identity exists in two completely different worlds. One is internal, the quiet understanding of yourself that nobody else can define. The other is external, built from documents, records, databases, and forms that institutions rely on every single day. Most people are lucky because those two worlds match perfectly. Mine didn't. As weeks turned into months, I started meeting people with stories even stranger than mine. One person had lived for years with the wrong birth date because of a hospital recording error. Another discovered that their surname had been misspelled since birth, creating endless legal problems. Someone else found out they technically didn't exist in one government database despite paying taxes for decades. Listening to their experiences changed my perspective. I realized I wasn't completely alone. Mistakes happen. Systems built by humans can fail. The real challenge isn't preventing every error. It's how those errors affect real people whose lives continue long after the paperwork is filed. Still, there were difficult moments. I remember standing in line one afternoon while another visitor accidentally saw part of my paperwork. Their expression changed instantly. They weren't trying to be rude, but curiosity took over. They asked a question that made everyone nearby turn and look. "Why does your document say female?" The room suddenly felt much smaller. For a split second, I considered pretending I hadn't heard them. Instead, I smiled politely and answered with complete honesty. "I've been trying to figure that out too." People laughed softly, the tension disappeared, and surprisingly, the conversation became supportive rather than judgmental. Several strangers began sharing stories about mistakes on their own documents. That unexpected moment reminded me that embarrassment often loses its power when you refuse to hide from it. The more this experience unfolded, the more I noticed how quickly people make assumptions based on labels. A single word printed on paper caused reactions ranging from confusion to sympathy, from curiosity to awkward silence. Yet none of those reactions actually changed who I was. The paperwork hadn't transformed me. It had only changed the way other people interpreted information about me. That realization became one of the biggest lessons of my entire life. I stopped seeing the records as something that defined me and started seeing them for what they really were: information that needed correcting, nothing more and nothing less. Ironically, once I reached that point mentally, the administrative process became even more complicated. Every time I thought I had reached the final step, another requirement appeared. One office needed a certified copy of my birth record. Another wanted a statement from the hospital where I was born. A different department insisted they couldn't update their system until another agency made the first change. It felt like every door had a lock, and every key belonged to someone standing behind another locked door. At one point, I actually joked that if I ever wrote a book about this experience, nobody would believe it. People love to say, "It's just paperwork," until they're the ones spending hours in waiting rooms holding a number ticket while watching the digital display move slower than time itself. One morning I arrived before the office even opened. There was already a line stretching outside the building. Everyone around me had their own reason for being there. Some needed passports. Others wanted birth certificates or marriage records. Looking around, I realized every single person carried a folder filled with documents that represented years of their lives. On paper, our identities were reduced to names, numbers, dates, and tiny checkboxes. Yet behind every folder was an entire human story that couldn't possibly fit inside those pages. As I waited, I started wondering how many people around me were dealing with mistakes nobody else could see. Maybe someone had the wrong address listed. Maybe another person had a misspelled name. Maybe someone else had spent months trying to prove something they already knew to be true. When my number was finally called, I sat across from another official who carefully reviewed every page. He paused longer than everyone else had. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Of course." "When did you first discover this?" I told him everything. He leaned back in his chair and quietly admitted he had seen similar cases before, though never one that had continued across so many different systems. That sentence caught my attention immediately. "Similar cases?" He nodded. "Not common," he explained, "but they happen." For the first time since this journey began, I felt a strange sense of relief. I wasn't the only person this had ever happened to. My situation wasn't impossible. It was unusual, but it wasn't unique. That small piece of information changed my mindset completely. Instead of feeling like I was fighting against the world, I started treating the process like solving a complicated puzzle. Every document I collected was another piece. Every signature brought the picture into clearer focus. Friends kept asking how things were going. At first, I'd give long explanations about offices, forms, verification letters, and databases. Eventually, I shortened my answer to one sentence. "I'm still convincing the paperwork to catch up with reality." People laughed, but underneath that joke was something surprisingly true. The strange thing about this experience wasn't the mistake itself. It was how often I found myself explaining my own identity to complete strangers who only knew me through a computer screen. Sometimes an employee would look at me, then look at the monitor, then back at me again. They weren't being disrespectful. Their eyes simply reflected confusion. The screen told one story. The person standing in front of them told another. Watching that happen over and over taught me something I had never considered before. Most people trust official information without questioning it. If a document says something, we instinctively believe it's correct because documents feel permanent. They feel authoritative. We assume someone checked everything before printing it. But humans create documents. Humans enter data. Humans make mistakes. Technology may store information perfectly, but it cannot guarantee that the information entered was correct in the first place. One afternoon, after leaving another office, I sat in my car without starting the engine. I just stared at the steering wheel for a while. Not because I was angry, not because I wanted to give up. I was simply exhausted. It's amazing how mentally draining something can become when every week feels like repeating the same conversation. Yes, that's my document. Yes, I know what it says. Yes, that's why I'm here. Yes, I'd like to correct it. Eventually, those sentences became automatic. Then something happened that I never expected. Instead of becoming frustrated with the process, I became fascinated by it. I started researching how birth records are created, how information moves between government databases, how corrections are processed, and why one small mistake can spread into multiple systems over decades. The deeper I looked, the more I understood that most people never think about these things because everything usually works. Until it doesn't. Once an incorrect detail enters a connected system, it can quietly copy itself again and again, becoming harder to trace with every passing year. It reminded me of a tiny crack in a windshield. At first, it's barely noticeable. Ignore it long enough, and suddenly the entire glass is affected. The mistake wasn't growing because it was changing. It was growing because it was being repeated. That realization made me less interested in blaming someone decades ago. Whoever entered the information was probably busy. Maybe they were tired after a long shift. Maybe handwriting was difficult to read. Maybe two forms were accidentally switched. Maybe it was a simple click on the wrong option. I'll probably never know. And honestly, I stopped needing to know. Because spending energy searching for someone to blame wouldn't solve the problem in front of me. One conversation during this journey has stayed with me more than any other. I met a woman who worked in records management for over 20 years. She listened patiently while reviewing my file. Then she smiled and said something I'll never forget. "People think paperwork is about facts." She paused. but paperwork is really about history. I asked her what she meant. She explained that every correction leaves a trail. Every update has to respect previous records. Systems aren't just storing today's information. They're preserving yesterday's decisions too. That's why correcting history can sometimes take much longer than creating it in the first place. That idea stayed in my mind for days. How often do we carry old versions of ourselves long after we've changed? Not just in documents, in memories, in other people's opinions, in labels we've outgrown. Sometimes society updates its view of us much slower than we update ourselves. I realized this experience had quietly become about much more than government records. It became a lesson in patience, a lesson in resilience, and, surprisingly, a lesson in identity. Because throughout the entire process, one question kept appearing in different forms. Who are you? The answer never changed. Only the paperwork did. Months after discovering the mistake, I finally received a phone call asking me to return to one of the offices. This was different. Their tone sounded more confident, more organized, almost optimistic. I arrived carrying the same folder that had become my constant companion. The employee greeted me with a smile I hadn't seen before. "We've made progress." Those 3 words instantly erased months of frustration. Several departments had finally completed their verification. Historical records had been reviewed. Supporting documents matched. The correction process was moving forward. Not finished, but moving. After hearing that, something unexpected happened. Instead of celebrating immediately, I felt incredibly calm. I realized the biggest victory wasn't fixing the documents. It was surviving the uncertainty that came before them. Anyone can celebrate once everything works out. The difficult part is continuing to believe things will improve when every week looks exactly like the last. That kind of patience changes a person. I walked outside that building feeling lighter than I had in months. Not because every problem had disappeared, but because for the first time, the system and reality were finally beginning to tell the same story. And yet, the most surprising moment of this entire journey still hadn't happened. The most surprising moment didn't happen inside a government office. It didn't happen during an interview, a phone call, or while holding a corrected document in my hands. It happened during an ordinary conversation with someone who had absolutely no idea what I had been dealing with. I was sitting in a small cafe, waiting for my coffee, when the person next to me started talking about how stressful paperwork could be. We laughed about long lines, confusing forms, and the endless cycle of signatures. Then they said something that caught my attention. "At least paperwork doesn't change who you are." I smiled because only a few months earlier, I would have argued with that statement. Back then, it felt like those records controlled everything. They determined how systems identified me. They created awkward conversations. They delayed applications. They forced me to explain myself again and again. But now I understood exactly what they meant. Paperwork can change opportunities. It can create obstacles. It can complicate life. But it cannot rewrite your identity. Only people give paper that kind of power. That conversation made me realize how much I had changed since discovering the mistake. At the beginning, every incorrect document felt like a personal attack. I questioned everything. I wondered what people would think if they saw it. I worried about every future application and every official interaction. Months later, those fears had slowly disappeared. Not because the mistake no longer mattered. It mattered. It absolutely needed to be corrected. But it no longer controlled my confidence. That's a very different thing. One lesson became clearer every single day. Confidence doesn't come from having a perfect life. It comes from knowing who you are even when life becomes imperfect. Looking back, I almost laughed at the way I reacted during those first few days. I remember checking every document over and over as if the words would magically change if I stared long enough. Female, female, female. Every page told the same story. At the time, it felt overwhelming. Today, those memories remind me how quickly panic can shrink once we begin taking action. Problems always appear larger before we understand them. Another interesting thing happened during this journey. The more open I became about my experience, the more stories people shared with me. One person told me they had spent years correcting an incorrect birth date. Another explained that their first name had been spelled differently across multiple official systems. Someone else discovered they technically had two different identification numbers because of an administrative mistake made decades earlier. None of these people had done anything wrong. Life had simply handed them unexpected complications. Listening to them taught me something important. Everyone carries invisible challenges. You rarely notice them because most people become experts at hiding the frustrating parts of their lives. We usually see polished success. We almost never see the paperwork behind it. If this experience taught me anything, it's that patience often wins battles that frustration never could. Were there days when I wanted to quit? Absolutely. Were there moments when another missing document made me want to walk away? Of course. But every small step mattered. Every completed form. Every verified record. Every corrected detail. Progress rarely feels dramatic while it's happening. It usually feels slow. Almost invisible. Then one day you look back and realize you've traveled much farther than you imagined. Finally, after what felt like an endless journey, I received confirmation that the correction had been approved. I must have read that message 10 times before it actually felt real. Not because I doubted the words, because I had spent so long waiting to see them. When I collected the updated documents, I held them quietly for a moment. No celebration. No dramatic reaction. Just silence. It wasn't the paper that made the moment meaningful. It was everything the paper represented. Months of persistence. Countless conversations. Endless patience. And a reminder that sometimes the smallest correction requires the greatest determination. Walking out of that office, I realized something unexpected. I wasn't leaving with a new identity. I was leaving with paperwork that finally reflected the identity I'd had all along. That's a huge difference. People often confuse recognition with transformation. I hadn't become someone new. The records had simply caught up with reality. That distinction changed the way I think about labels forever. Since then, whenever someone asks me why this experience mattered so much, I tell them it was never really about one word printed on a document. It was about discovering how much of modern life depends on information we rarely think about. It was about learning patience when every shortcut disappeared. It was about staying calm while systems slowly untangled years of history. Most importantly, it was about understanding that identity begins with you, not with databases, forms, or official records. Those things are important. They should absolutely be accurate. But they should never become the only measure of who someone is. If you've ever felt misunderstood because of a label, judged because of a first impression, or limited by something written about you that didn't tell your whole story, then maybe you'll understand why this journey stayed with me long after the paperwork was corrected. Sometimes the world sees only a document. Sometimes it sees only a title. Sometimes it sees only a checkbox. But every human being is infinitely more complicated than a single line on a form. Ironically, the biggest lesson I learned wasn't hidden inside government files. It was hidden inside myself. I discovered that peace doesn't come from proving yourself to everyone else. It comes from no longer needing a piece of paper to remind you who you already know you are. Today, whenever I open that folder, I don't think about the mistake anymore. I think about the journey. I think about every person who helped me, every employee who took the extra time to investigate, every stranger who shared their own story, every family member who reminded me to keep going. Those memories matter far more than the error itself. And sometimes I wonder, how many people are living with mistakes they haven't discovered yet? How many official records quietly contain details nobody has questioned? Maybe more than we realize. So, if there's one thing I'd encourage everyone watching to do after hearing my story, it's this. Take a few minutes someday and look through your important documents carefully. Check the dates. Check the names. Check every detail. Not because you should expect something to be wrong, but because small mistakes are much easier to fix today than years from now. You never know what one overlooked detail could become decades later. As strange as this entire experience was, I don't regret going through it. It taught me resilience. It taught me patience. It taught me empathy for people dealing with bureaucratic challenges nobody else can see. And, perhaps most importantly, It reminded me that while records can be corrected, character is something you build yourself. That's the difference no form, no database, and no official stamp will ever be able to change. So yes, there was a time when every official record listed me as female. Today, those records tell a different story. But the person living that story was always the same. The strange thing was that once I stopped obsessing over the mistake itself, I began noticing how differently people reacted to the exact same piece of information. Some people immediately assumed there had been a complicated story behind it. Others thought it must have been a joke. A few believed it could never happen because official systems are supposed to be accurate. Every reaction revealed something interesting. People rarely respond to facts alone. They respond to the stories they create around those facts. One afternoon, I met an employee who had clearly seen unusual cases before. He looked through my file, smiled, and said, "You'd be surprised what we find in these archives." That sentence made me curious. I asked him if mistakes like mine happen often. He shook his head. Not often enough to call them common, but not rarely enough to call them impossible. I found that answer strangely comforting. For weeks I had felt like I was living inside an unbelievable story. Now I realized unbelievable stories happen to ordinary people every single day. Most of them simply never become public. As more documents were reviewed, I became fascinated by how one decision made years ago had quietly echoed through every stage of my life. Information copied from one database into another. One office relied on another office. Another relied on a third. Before long, nobody questioned whether the original information was correct because everyone trusted the previous record. It reminded me of standing in front of two mirrors facing each other. One reflection creates another, then another, then another. Eventually, you can't even tell which reflection came first. That's exactly how administrative errors survive. Not because they're constantly checked, because they're constantly repeated. During this period, I developed an unexpected habit. Whenever I completed another step in the correction process, I treated myself to something simple. Sometimes it was my favorite coffee. Sometimes it was a long walk through the park. Sometimes it was nothing more than sitting quietly without thinking about paperwork for an hour. Those tiny rewards kept me motivated. Progress doesn't always need a celebration. Sometimes it just needs acknowledgement. Friends kept asking if I was frustrated. I answered honestly, less than before. That surprised them. One friend asked, "How can you be calmer now? The problem still isn't completely solved." I thought about that question for a moment before answering. Because I've stopped measuring success by the finish line. They looked confused. I explained. If I only allow myself to feel successful when everything is perfect, I'll spend most of my life feeling like I'm failing. But if I appreciate every small step forward, then progress becomes something I experience every week. That conversation stayed with both of us. Sometimes the way we measure success determines whether life feels impossible or manageable. Another thing changed during this journey. I became much more patient with customer service workers, receptionists, and office staff. Before all of this happened, I assumed delays meant people weren't doing their jobs properly. Now I understood something different. Many of them were trying to solve problems created years before they ever joined the organization. They weren't responsible for the mistake. They were simply the people trying to untangle it. That realization made me kinder. It's easy to blame the person standing in front of you. It's much harder and much more accurate to recognize that complex systems rarely fail because of one individual. One rainy afternoon, I was asked to provide yet another supporting document. For a brief moment, I almost laughed. If someone had secretly been filming my life, it probably would have looked like a comedy. Every time I thought I had collected the final piece of paperwork, another request appeared. I remember joking with the clerk. At this point, if you ask for a document signed by my kindergarten teacher, I wouldn't even be surprised. She laughed so hard, she had to cover her mouth. Then she replied, "Please don't give the system any ideas." Moments like that mattered more than people realize. Humor doesn't solve problems, but it makes carrying them much easier. One evening, while organizing my folder, I noticed how thick it had become. What started as a simple collection of identification papers had turned into months of letters, copies, certifications, receipts, appointment slips, and verification forms. Looking at that stack, I realized something. Every page represented effort. None of those papers existed because life was easy. They existed because I refused to stop. Sometimes perseverance isn't dramatic. It doesn't always look inspiring. Sometimes perseverance looks like waking up early for another appointment, printing another copy, waiting through another queue, explaining the same situation one more time without losing your patience. Those ordinary moments are where resilience is actually built. Not in grand speeches, not in perfect victories, in quiet consistency. Around that time, someone asked me a question that completely caught me off guard. If you could go back in time and prevent this mistake from ever happening, would you? At first, the answer seemed obvious. Of course I would. Who would willingly choose months of inconvenience? But the more I thought about it, the more complicated the answer became. Without this experience, I never would have met the people who helped me. I never would have learned how these systems really work. I never would have discovered how much patience I was capable of. I never would have understood how quickly people judge labels without knowing the full story. Most importantly, I never would have appreciated something as ordinary as accurate paperwork. It's funny how we take normal things for granted until normal disappears. You don't appreciate smooth roads until you drive on rough ones. You don't appreciate good health until you're sick. And you rarely appreciate correct records until they aren't correct. That lesson extended far beyond documents. It changed how I looked at everyday life. I stopped assuming everything worked perfectly behind the scenes. I became more careful, more observant, more willing to double-check details instead of assuming someone else already had. The experience also made me think about identity in a broader sense. Throughout life, people assign us labels. Student, employee, friend, parent, successful, unsuccessful, confident, shy. Some labels fit, others don't. The danger comes when we begin believing every label automatically tells the whole story. It doesn't. A label can describe one detail without describing the person. That's exactly what happened with my records. One incorrect word became the first thing systems saw, yet it never captured who I actually was. The same thing happens in everyday life. People often reduce others to one characteristic, one mistake, one achievement, or one opinion. Real human beings are always more complex than that. Eventually, the correction process entered its final stages. The waiting became quieter. Fewer phone calls. Fewer appointments. Fewer surprises. Instead of feeling excited, I felt reflective. The journey had lasted long enough that it had become part of my routine. Oddly enough, I knew I'd miss certain parts of it. Not the paperwork. Definitely not the waiting rooms. But the conversations, the lessons, the unexpected kindness from strangers, the reminder that patience is a skill, not a personality trait. Looking back now, I can honestly say the biggest change wasn't in my documents. It was in me. Before this happened, I believed certainty came from systems. Now I know certainty comes from knowing yourself. Systems can be corrected. Records can be updated. Files can be rewritten. But self-understanding is something no office can issue and no clerk can stamp. That's a lesson I carry with me long after the paperwork was finally corrected. A few weeks later, I received another phone call. By that point, I had learned not to celebrate too early. Every previous call had usually led to another form, another signature, or another document I didn't even know existed. So when my phone rang and the office asked me to come in, I thanked them politely, wrote down the appointment time, and kept my expectations low. Still, something about the employee's voice sounded different. There was confidence in the way they spoke. Not hesitation. Not uncertainty. Confidence. The morning of my appointment felt strangely ordinary. I drove the same route I had driven so many times before. I parked in the same parking lot. I walked through the same entrance where months earlier I had first realized that fixing one incorrect word would become one of the longest administrative journeys of my life. Only this time, I wasn't nervous. I wasn't frustrated. I was simply curious. When my number appeared on the screen, I walked to the counter, greeted the employee, and handed over my identification. She smiled. "I think you'll be happy today." Those 6 words instantly made every long wait, every confusing conversation, and every frustrating delay feel a little lighter. She opened my file, reviewed several pages, and then slowly turned her computer monitor toward me. For the first time, she said, "Every connected record matches." I stared at the screen for a few seconds. Not because there was anything dramatic to see. In fact, it looked incredibly ordinary. A name, a birth date, an identification number, one corrected entry. That's all. Anyone walking past would have thought I was looking at the most boring computer screen imaginable. But I knew exactly how much work had gone into making that screen look so ordinary. Sometimes the biggest victories don't look exciting. They simply restore normal life. The employee printed several updated documents and carefully placed them on the counter. I picked them up one by one. For months, I had become almost afraid of reading that particular line. Every previous document had carried the same incorrect information. This time, it matched reality. No confusion. No explanation. No awkward conversations waiting to happen. Just accuracy. For a moment, I didn't say anything. Then I quietly smiled. The employee noticed. "You've been very patient," she said. I answered with complete honesty. "I didn't always feel patient." She laughed. "I don't think anyone would." As I prepared to leave, she surprised me with one final comment. "You know, most people only remember government offices when something goes wrong." I nodded. She continued. "But stories like yours remind us why accuracy matters." That sentence stayed with me all the way home. Accuracy isn't exciting. People rarely celebrate it. We only notice it when it disappears. That afternoon, I placed every corrected document back into the same folder that had traveled with me for months. Only now the folder felt different. Lighter somehow. Not because there were fewer papers. If anything, there were more. But the uncertainty was gone. Looking through those pages one last time, I realized something I hadn't understood at the beginning. The real challenge was never correcting a document. The real challenge was protecting my peace while waiting for the correction to happen. Anyone can feel confident when life is simple. Real confidence is staying grounded while life is complicated. Over the following months, life slowly returned to normal. Applications became easier. Appointments became routine. Nobody looked twice at my records anymore. The endless explanations stopped. The awkward pauses disappeared. Eventually, I found myself going entire weeks without thinking about what had happened. That surprised me. For so long, the situation had occupied my thoughts almost every day. Now it had quietly become another chapter of my past. Not forgotten. Simply finished. Occasionally, someone still asks me why I share this story. After all, the problem has already been solved. Why talk about it? Because the paperwork was only half the story. The other half was everything it taught me. It taught me not to panic the moment something unexpected happens. It taught me that complicated problems are usually solved one small step at a time. It taught me that patience isn't passive. Patience is active. It's choosing to keep moving forward even when progress feels invisible. It also reminded me how powerful assumptions can be. Many people believe official records are perfect. Many believe mistakes only happen to someone else. Many assume that if information exists in multiple systems, it must be correct. My experience proved otherwise. Sometimes the most trusted information is simply the oldest information. Age doesn't guarantee accuracy. Verification does. Another unexpected lesson came from the people around me. Throughout this journey, I experienced far more kindness than judgment. Employees stayed after hours to help locate records. Supervisors made phone calls on my behalf. Complete strangers shared encouraging words while we waited in line together. Friends checked in just to ask whether there had been any progress. Family members reminded me not to lose hope whenever another delay appeared. Those moments mattered, because difficult experiences have a strange way of revealing the character of the people around you. Some disappear. Others quietly become your biggest supporters. Looking back, I don't remember every form I completed. I don't remember every office number. I don't remember every appointment date. What I remember are the people, the smiles, the conversations, the encouragement. Those memories lasted much longer than the paperwork itself. If I could speak to the version of myself who first discovered that mistake months earlier, I'd probably say something very simple.
Take a deep breath.
This will take longer than you expect. It will be more frustrating than you imagine. There will be days when you think nothing is changing. But don't confuse slow progress with no progress.
Keep going. One form at a time. One appointment at a time.
One conversation at a time. Eventually, you'll look back and realize every small step was moving you toward the finish line. That's true for paperwork. It's true for careers. It's true for relationships. It's true for almost every meaningful goal in life. Big outcomes are usually built from small, repetitive actions that don't feel important in the moment. Today, when I open my document folder, I no longer search for mistakes. Instead, it reminds me of resilience. It reminds me that identity cannot be reduced to a single checkbox. It reminds me that truth doesn't become false because a database says otherwise. Most importantly, it reminds me that our response to unexpected challenges often defines us far more than the challenges themselves. So yes, there really was a time when every official record listed me as female. It sounds unbelievable. Sometimes it still sounds unbelievable to me. But that single administrative mistake ended up teaching me lessons I might never have learned any other way. And maybe that's why I no longer see it as the worst thing that ever happened to me. I see it as one of the most unusual teachers I've ever had. If you've watched this entire journey, I hope you take away one simple message. Never let a label, a record, or someone else's assumption decide who you are. Documents are important. Accuracy matters. Systems matter. But none of them are powerful enough to define your worth. Only you can do that. And in the end, after every office visit, every correction request, every long wait, and every unexpected obstacle, I walked away with something far more valuable than corrected paperwork. I walked away with absolute confidence that no matter what any file, form, or record says, the truest version of your identity has never lived on paper. It has always lived within you. And that's something no mistake can ever take away.